Good evening. Hi, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to this evening's workshop. Well, it's billed as a workshop, but we're going to keep it a bit more casual, a bit more conversational. We'll leave lots of room for your questions. So get popping them in the chat, put them in the chat at any point, and we'll come to those towards the end. So this evening's event is about the Mairtín Crawford Awards, which are awards for emerging writers with the Belfast Book Festival in association with the Crescent Arts Centre. I'm Lucy Caldwell, and I'm here with my dear friend, fellow judge of the awards, and fine writer, Wendy Erskine. Wendy, welcome. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing really well, thank you, Lucy, and it is lovely to be speaking to you. I look forward to this. We've been doing this the last couple of years, and I really look forward to chatting to you every year.
It's always such a pleasure. Yeah, me too, Wendy. Let's jump straight in. These awards, they are for emerging writers, by which the terms of the awards say you maybe haven't written anything yet, or you're working towards a first collection, maybe written a couple of stories, but you're kind of at the beginning of your writing life, your publishing life. So I wanted to think, Wendy, about getting started. And it seems to me that there's a couple of things that you need to work out how to deal with and continue to work out how to deal with. Dealing with distraction and procrastination, like all the stuff that stops you from getting started, and also dealing with the feelings of shame and self-consciousness that you can have when you're first starting to publish or to submit stories for publication. Um, I'm not sure maybe we should handle those as two separate things. What would you say to people who maybe want to write, but they're finding it very hard to get started? They're constantly distracted or put off.
Well, I think that is, most people, a lot of people have got really busy lives. You're going to have all sorts of commitments, whether you're a carer, whether you're looking after children, whether you've got a busy job, whatever. So it's just going to be fact that the vast majority of people are absolutely going to have all sorts of distractions and all sorts of things competing for their time. And so I suppose what I feel you have to do is you have to consider whether or not this is important to you. Because even if you're a person who has got so much else going on, there'll be other things in your life that you've decided that you want to spend time on, or else maybe you haven't decided and it's just something that you automatically do. So it may well be that at present you spend ages looking at videos on YouTube on your phone or whatever, and you've managed to integrate that into your life, and you don't even think of it as a way of spending your time. But if you're going to write, I think you need to carve out a little bit of time for yourself, not necessarily every single day, but carve out a little bit of time that you're going to dedicate to this. And I suppose one of the things, Lucy, I don't know if you feel this is true, but I think sometimes people can be very intimidated because they think that they have to write from the beginning something that is fully formed. And we know that if you're writing, where you start writing is never going to be the beginning of your story. And I think that's something that, procrastination, sometimes that whole idea of perfectionism, people say that perfectionism is basically procrastination masquerading as quality control, right? That's a very pat little thing, but it makes a lot of sense to me. And people kind of get a bit intimidated, and it's a bit off-putting thinking that whenever you sit down, you have to be absolutely producing something great right from the beginning. You don't. Just try to enjoy it. Know that wherever you start is not necessarily going to be the beginning of the story, whatever. And don't be hard on yourself. Just see what you can manage to do. And if it's only 40 minutes, absolutely fine. Most people, even people with very busy lives, will have maybe half an hour or 40 minutes that they can spend working on something. And if you can do that with a little bit of regularity, maybe not every single day, but if you can do that with a little bit of regularity, before too long, you'll have some sort of material that you can start thinking about. What do you think, Lucy, in terms of that?
I think that I think that mobile phones get such a bad rap these days. And, as any parent, I'm always conscious of, my children's screen time. And ironically, my daughter's playing Minecraft at the minute. That's what's giving us the peace and time to have this conversation.
Yeah.
But actually, do you know what? I have so many beautiful, pristine notebooks because people quite often give you these beautiful, notebooks like wrapped in old saris with ribbons, or like the really good architectural ones like the Lighterm or the Moleskin. I never write a word in them because I have very bad handwriting. I never learned joined up, because I always think my thoughts aren't good enough to be committed to paper, because I think they'll always look too messy when they're there. But I love my phone because I can just I keep a dream journal, because I think it's really important to keep that link to your subconscious open. And the way that I keep it, I just have a notes app on my phone that every morning, not every morning, but every morning that I can remember something, I just tap it into my phone. Or it means that if I have an idea, I can catch it, I can build on it. When something feels like it's got enough momentum, I can then just send it to my laptop and start working on it there. But I think that sort of fits in with what you're saying about the idea of perfectionism, and also the idea of going easy on yourself when you start. Sometimes my notes on my phone are objectively terrible, but you don't censor yourself. You don't worry if something is a cliche or something is really bad. You're just kind of trying to catch something you can later play with.
That's it, and you don't know. I mean, nothing's very fully formed for me. It's normally just some random sorts of ideas. I don't know if they're going to connect. It's excuse me, maybe a random bunch of characters. I don't know how they're going to all fit together, but it's just thinking and getting ideas together. And that point you made there, where you were saying as well about the sort of shame of it, the idea that this is something that potentially is a public thing that you're doing, particularly if you're a person that's normally really quite private. That's also a real thing to try to come to terms with. Like, I can remember, I don't think I've ever said this to you, but I can remember the very first time, whenever it seemed like I might have something printed. I can remember thinking about all the people that would potentially maybe read it, and of course, in some ways, that's terribly self-centered. It's terribly egocentric to think of all the people that are going to read it. Probably the vast majority of them will never come across it. But I can remember thinking, oh my goodness, Lucy Caldwell might read this story. Oh my goodness, imagine if Lucy Caldwell read it. Like, oh, gosh, it's embarrassing thinking of Lucy reading something I've done, and it's absolutely preposterous, that, really, because anything you ever do, it's like, you put on an outfit in the morning. If you were to think, as I walk down my road, many people will dislike what I'm wearing. In fact, now I think I won't go out anymore, because I'm worried about the reception I might get. If you thought about it, about every action that you ever do, it would be utterly crippling. And I think writing's just like this, just like that.
And especially with the age of social media we live in, where people can and do let you know their thoughts, I think that can be really hard.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it? It's like, for me, the only thing that's worse than doing it is not doing it. That sounds like a very kind of negative way of putting it, but it took me years to write any stories that were any good. And I think that was partly I wasn't technically good enough to do any of the things that I wanted to do. But it was also a level of emotional bravery as well. I cared what people thought. I felt self-conscious. I didn't want to expose myself. And funnily, the thing that changed for me was I had a very traumatic birth of my son, and he was very ill shortly after birth. And I wrote a story, the title story of Multitudes. I wrote that was a version of the time we spent in, isolation wards, neonatal care with him. And I had always thought that having children would be the end of my creative life. That pram in the hallway, I had internalized it to the extent that I thought, well, I've never written anything that good. I'd published three novels, wasn't really that happy with any of them, hadn't
We're
managed to write
not.
any stories.
No.
No, it felt like they weren't really, it felt like I was trying to conceal. I have a, yeah, I was never fully happy with any of them. Hadn't managed to write any of the short stories I wanted to. And then when my son was so ill, I wrote that story again on the phone, back to being on my phone. And I wrote it with a sense that I was writing for my artistic survival. Like I really had this feeling that I'd never quite had before, that I wanted something to survive of this experience. You know, and so I wrote this story, and I felt it was a moment of really thinking, I don't care what anyone thinks. Really doesn't matter. I don't care what critics think. I don't care what, my parents think. I don't care what my friends think. I don't even care what my editor, I don't care what any. And that was such a kind of wild freedom. And of course, something of that, when you're out of the white heat of that, something of that recedes. But I was able to hang on to that feeling of, this is what it feels like. It doesn't really matter. It doesn't, there's something Sheila Hetty says that I always find really useful. And she says, why should I be ashamed of anything? Because there's nothing that I could possibly do or think that hasn't been done or thunk, that hasn't been done or thought by someone else. We're communal animals. And so yeah, so that was, but I think everyone has to work out who are the people that they're afraid of reading their work, and you have to come to the arrangement with yourself that to not do it is worse than to do it.
Yeah. And quite often, I think you could be possibly very surprised by the people that you think may not like your work, or the people that you think it might offend. That's actually not, you're underestimating them. They can actually cope with it very well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for everyone who's submitting stories to this award, a beautiful thing is this award is judged completely anonymously.
Mhm.
Um, we have no information beyond the title and the story. We don't know names, we don't know ages, we don't know any facts about the authors. One of the exciting moments actually is when we have settled on our shortlist and we've settled on our winner and our runner-up, and then we deliver the names over and we say who are our winners. We know nothing before then. So I think it can be freeing to think that, even if you know us or we might know you, um, we're never going to know. It's completely anonymous.
And sometimes it's such a surprise. There'll be somebody that I will kind of thought that perhaps this is a young man has written this story, and it's absolutely not. It's somebody absolutely different. Um, and it's one of the great things about a competition like this, that the stories are so different. Everything's blind. It's like exciting when you click on the next story, or whenever you lift the next if you've printed them out, whenever you lift the next printout, because it's like, wow, it's just taking you to a totally different place, like a totally different universe, totally different preoccupations. It's brilliant.
When you're reading the stories, Wendy, is there something, you had this brilliant analogy of going into TK Maxx, knowing
Yeah.
you want something but not knowing what it is. Like when you're reading the stories, what is it that you're looking for, or what is it that makes you think, I never knew that I needed, a gold belt with a Buddha in the center, but that's what I need.
Well, yeah, I mean, I sometimes, sometimes I look at people that are judging competitions, and quite often, if you are a judge, you do get asked this, what is it you're looking for? And sometimes people will list, well, I'm looking for this, I'm looking for this, and looking for this, and they can list that quite definitively and specifically. And I don't feel like that at all. And I feel totally, that analogy that I use absolutely stands every single year. That it's like going into a big shop where you want to get something, but you don't know what it is, but you'll know it when you see it. Like TK Maxx, it could be anything. It could be a hairbrush, it could be a suitcase, it could be I don't know, a face cream, anything. So I suppose what I want to happen is that for the duration of your story, I I want to be convinced by it, and I want to be in the world of that story. Um, I don't care if not much happens, but I want to feel that it's a world that I've been immersed in a really engaging way. Um, and it's very difficult to quantify how that happens, or what techniques you have to do. but I know it I know it whenever I read it. And one of the things I'd have to really stress, Lucy, is that, you know, I write a particular type of short story. Maybe I've got particular preoccupations, maybe I have particular settings, but that's not what I want to read myself necessarily. I'm going through a Ursula Le Guin phase at present, which I adore. You know,
Honey, liquids on my desk. The,
oh
the
wow,
essays,
wow,
yeah.
wow.
They are absolutely
Um,
amazing.
um,
She's this amazing essay from 1976 called The Space Crone that begins, the menopause is probably the least glamorous topic imaginable. And this is interesting because it's one of the very few topics to which cling some shreds and remnants of taboo. And it's like 1976 and she's straight in there. And that sentence feels so fresh and her slant of things. Yeah, yeah, brilliant.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
So, it's one of those things that totally open to all sorts of stories of all sorts of types. That doesn't matter whatsoever, but it needs to be a world that feels fully realized, and a world that seems convincing, from the moment whenever I leave my reality and enter into it, to the moment whenever you're asking me to break off from your fictive world and go back into my reality, that I'm held there for the duration. What
Yeah,
about you?
it's funny. We hadn't talked about Le Guin before, but I picked this book up in a local secondhand bookshop. Again, like your TK Maxx thing, I just gone in there actually just to kill some time to see what there was. And it's that thing where you're picking up books, you're looking at them, writers you know, writers you absolutely don't, and then you pick up a volume and you think, I did not know until the opening sentence that I needed a 1976 essay by Ursula Le Guin on the menopause as taboo. You
Yeah,
know, you think, but this is what I'm here for.
yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I mean, my probably one of my favorite books last year was that book Hunchback by Sarah Chikawa, which is about a woman with severe disabilities living in a care home who is writing erotica online. And then one of the people in her facility discovers that she's doing that, and all sorts of things ensue. And I mean, how could you have imagined that that was what you wanted to read? But it was just absolutely, absolutely phenomenal. So no one should feel that they need to go down any kind of tried and tested routes. And I think we were talking a little bit there about that idea of kind of like self-consciousness, or you know realizing that you're writing in a tradition that so many people have done such brilliant things, but there's no point in you sitting down and thinking, I'm going to write a story like Lucy Caldwell, or I'm going to write a story like Colin Barrett, or I'm going to try and write a story in this sort of Danielle McLaughlin mode or whatever, because you can't do it. No matter how hard you try, you won't be able to do it. So you have to work out what it is you want to do.
Yeah, do you know an interesting thing actually? There's a thing that I used to do that I thought of as a sort of literary karaoke. And when I was writing stories, sometimes stories that weren't working, and I was struggling to think of something or anything to write, I would sometimes get a short story that I loved, and I would type it to see what it felt like. And an interesting thing is, I remember doing this in particular with a story by Nabokov called Spring in Fialta. And if you ever, and I mean, you can do it, type a Nabokov story. And what I found so interesting was the rhythms of it were so unlike what I would naturally do. Every time one of my sentences would sort of come to a close, sort of come downward, his would sort of spiral up and have another loop and then another. And it was really, I found it fascinating and it was instructive to me because I sort of thought, okay, so I don't write this kind of Baroque prose. What comes naturally to me is something else. And coming, I think so much of writing is trusting your instincts and questioning your defaults. I think it can be really fun if there is a short story writer or a particular short story that you love. There's probably some aspect of resonance. It might be no bad thing to type it out. Just don't submit it to the Mairtín Crawford Award under your name, but type it to kind of feel the rhythms of it. I think that can be quite fun.
I saw that online that somebody was running a course. It was sort of like a copybook course where you copy out chunks of George Eliot. Have you seen that? You
I
copy
have.
out chunks of George Eliot and Henry James and things like that. And it's exactly as you say, that you're copying it out. And they're saying that through all this sort of copying, and then you must talk about it at some point. But it's going to in some way improve your own technique and make you think about how you write. So I might do a wee DIY version of it over the next couple of weeks
Yeah,
myself.
let us know. Let me know who you choose.
Yeah,
How it
yeah,
goes. Yeah, brilliant. This idea of I want to go back to where stories come from, because you have this other lovely analogy, Wendy, of going along the street with some coins in your pocket, like
yeah.
weighing, deciding what to spend them on. Um, how do you know if you're like it was funny, we were talking in the breakout room just before this, and we were laughing because everything we told each other about our lives and catching up, we were thinking this could be a short story. And Alan, lovely Alan, who's doing all the tech, he contributed a couple of his own that we were instantly able to flip and turn into a short story. Is that a muscle thing for you? Is it a knack? Is it a way of seeing the world? Of all the observed world, the world that you experience, the world that you live through, the world that you take in online, how do you know what has it in it to be a story?
I don't initially. I don't at all. So for me, it's I suppose that that analogy of like I've got coins in my pocket. Normally something or other will have happened. Think I'll have noticed something, and I think I always use that same Zola quotation, like art is a corner of you know creation seen through a temperament. That's all you've got. All you've got is your particular take on the world and how you see things. And so there'll maybe be things that I notice that other people might not, and there'll maybe be things that other people will notice that I wouldn't dream of ever. I just wouldn't notice it. It just isn't something I'd ever dream of paying attention to. So initially, I don't know at all what is if something's going to work, but I suppose something will start me off thinking, and then that will normally, it's just sort of a concatenation of things that will then normally lead to me thinking maybe about a character, and then that might make me think about another character. And it's very, very hazy. It's very sort of diffuse. It's just sorts of general ideas kind of coalescing, I suppose you would say. So say for example, right, I really like nail bars, and there was a thing the other week there where somebody was wanting, they'd shown their picture and they were wanting a sort of flower to be kind of like stuck onto their nail, this white flower. And the woman was finding it really, really difficult to do because she was having to kind of sculpt this thing out of plastic. I mean, who would want a big plastic flower stuck on their finger? I don't know, but this woman did. And the guy, we also realized that the guy had to go, who was doing it, had to go and pick up his daughter from school. And so he was supervising the woman that was doing this thing, and so it was kind of quite high stakes. Suddenly this became incredibly high stakes, this thing of this person trying to sculpt this flower and stick it onto somebody's nail, and maybe about 10 people were all watching this woman do it. And her hand was starting to shake and shake because there was such an audience. And I thought, right, there's something here that totally disparate people are now all concentrated on this tiny little, talk about Austin's little half inch of ivory. I mean, this is like a minuscule part of somebody's nail. I thought this is interesting. This is like something I could maybe use. And then I started to think about characters to do with that. But I wouldn't know if that's a story or not. I have my usual way of working, which would be a really long first draft where I just
Take
blast.
this. So you would take this and what would you do? Would you sit at your laptop and you
Yeah,
would like what would you just
yes.
play?
So I would sit at my laptop and maybe I might start just describing that incident that I've just described to you. And then I would maybe let it go back in time, and I would maybe focus on maybe write a bit from the perspective of one of the people that was watching that. I might maybe then write from my own perspective about going home and whatever I did afterwards. Quite often I'm in these things quite early on, and then I try to take myself out of them. I would maybe talk about the life of somebody else that was in at that point, and there's no shape to it. I've no idea. I'm just trying to amass material. And then after that, what I start doing is you know, writing that draft, leaving it for a bit, reading it back and thinking, is there anything here? So say like Tessa Hadley, who I think is a wonderful writer. I know that she, Lucy, would do it totally differently to me, that she's crafting one sentence at a time and getting it just beautiful and getting it right. But I don't work like that. I just don't know what's happening until quite far down the process. What about you? How would you do it?
Yeah, I'm much more like you. With when I interviewed Colm Toy Bean at the Belfast Book Festival, I'm sure some of you here were in the audience. He said, I was so horrified by this. He said he always imagines that he's got gold in his fountain pen, and so he has to spend it so carefully, and so he writes very meticulously, like very precisely, much more like the Tessa Hadley, sent. And he is such a consummate stylist. But I need to get a bigger sense of the sweep of the thing before I do that. There definitely comes a draft of my work where I'm going through minutely, looking at the punctuation, looking at everything, like really, really concentrating on every single word, every single decision. But for early things, I think I would actually, even before, like I've got a longer stage before I even take it to a laptop. I would spend a long time thinking. I would have notes on my phone. What I would do is I would wander the streets, trying to tune into the rhythms of the story, just letting the characters speak in my head. I think that partly comes from, being a playwright where you need to ventriloquize your characters. But until I had a clear sort of sense of what this character, I love the moment where I lose myself, so it's not me consciously thinking, it's just the idea of the character, or if I'm doing a second person story, it's still sort of a version of the character. And the moment that I love is the moment that I feel I've completely disappeared and the story has nothing to do with me. That's the moment that I think I would start. When I can feel the rhythms, that's when I would start writing it. But again, like I want to ask you in a moment about, beginnings and endings and middle. And for me, I would have no hope of knowing how a story begins until I've kind of got to the end and tried to see, okay, what is this? I'm making a shape. Like what is this thing?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I would have no idea whatsoever about that either. And hopefully, people, if they're listening to this, I mean, obviously, there's any number of ways that you can work, and you may be, the Colin Bean style, Tessa Hadley style writer, and that is fine. But people hearing us talking here, hopefully, this is something that feels quite liberating. That you do not need to have all of this planned out from the beginning, and you do not need to know necessarily where things are going, and it's actually quite a delightful, to me, that's a very delightful part of the writing process, where you're just going with it and trying to understand what it is that these characters are wanting to be, or what they're telling you. It's a really lovely thing, and I would spend quite a lot of time walking around as well, and I would also I spend quite a lot of time having the characters having conversations with each other, and I know sometimes I must look absolutely bonkers, because I'll sometimes be going like, even imagining how they would be speaking to each other. So it feels very real for me that these people are talking. I
Yeah,
think.
sometimes my children will look at my face and they'll say, "Mummy, like, what are you doing?" I'll have some kind of agonized expression because I'm letting the character speak. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be going like one of the characters will have had this great comeback, and it'll be like, yeah, like that, and it's like, yeah, there's nobody there to actually hear. It's it's one of those things that sometimes people will say, are there no shortcuts? I was wanting to hear shortcuts, or I was wanting to know about short story hacks. And again, this is purely just from my point of view. There are no short story hacks or short story shortcuts. That in a sense, all of this is part of what you need to do to get something to work, but also it's enjoyable to do
It
this.
happened. Yeah, it's funny. I have a story in my new collection. It's called Hamlet, a love story. It's about 8,000 words. I put together like a pack, a document of all the drafts I did of that story to show some of my own writing students like what a story literally looks like, from the very first note on my iPhone through all of the terrible, like bad writing drafts as I kind of made it better. And I stopped that draft of that document at 70,000 words. Like 70,000 words that's different drafts. That's like a 350 page novel. You know, sometimes a story takes that, but I think at other times there is a real joy to be had in my story, All the People Were Mean and Bad, which is about a transatlantic flight and Noah's Ark. I thought about that story for about a year, let the characters talk in my head. As soon as I caught the tone of that story, I wrote that story in 2 mornings. I still had very young children I was looking after, and I wrote the story in, I think, 2 3 hour mornings, and then I remember finishing it. I remember thinking, I only have Tuesday and Wednesday mornings as my working time. If I leave this in the hope that I might get some time at the weekend or wait till my next Tuesday, I'll have lost the thread of it. It'll have gone. And so I remember putting on Dumbo for the children to watch as I tried to block out all the music of Dumbo and just finish that story. And then there are other stories I've written where I have a story called Unter den Linden, that's set in Berlin, where I was for the first time on the day that Russia invaded Ukraine. And I walked down East Berlin, Alexanderplatz to the Brandenburg Gate, and I wanted to capture something of the day, almost like sending in a dart to take a sample of the day. And I got back from that trip on Sunday evening. I emailed a draft of that story to the other writers I was with on Tuesday tea time. And so I sometimes think of that as just like a musician might, a session musician might play, or someone does a fresco style painting. You just need to work really fast before something dries. So I think as well, you can just catch something and you can get something done pretty, like no two stories have been exactly the same for me.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's absolutely true that you can work like that as well. And I think, for every single thing that I'm ever saying about short stories, I can nearly always think of a time when the opposite has also been true, you know? So you can make splashy pronouncements and then go, yeah, but it didn't happen like that with this one or this one. I did a story for Radio 3 just before Christmas, and it was a response to Schubert, Winterreise song cycle. And I was I just totally forgotten that I was meant to write that story. I just totally had forgotten about it. And so I had to do it in about 2 days, and I just had to immerse myself in that music because I didn't really know it. And so I had to just listen to it non-stop. And then another, and I got it written, and it was actually it was a really nice experience doing it. And another time, Stinging Fly in Dublin, they actually ran a special. It was like write a story in 48 hours, where a whole group of people, about 100 people, were all given prompts, and they all had to write the story in 48 hours. And as it turned out, I just didn't even really have 48 hours, to be honest. It just happened. The 2 days were over time whenever I had a load of stuff going on. So probably written about not even 8 hours. It was a short story, it's only about 1,500 words, but again, writing within particular types of parameters and writing in a very, very short space of time can also produce something interesting. But they're not my favorite stories of mine. Probably because I'm more attached to working in a different type of way. But I think they're okay.
Yeah, I think I mean, I've got the double check these dates on the website, everyone, but midday on Wednesday, the 11th of March is when submissions close for the Mairtín Crawford Award. So, 2,500 words, that's a decent short story. That's like 15 minutes on the radio.
Mhm.
I think it's a really good length of story. It gives you the kind of freedom to do something. It's more than flash fiction, although there's no minimum word limit. You can go as short as you want. But I think, yeah, especially if you're struggling or need some kind of galvanizing force, it is possible. It's possible to, going back to what we said, Wendy, that you need to make the time, you need to ring fence the time, you need to be really, really ferocious, I think, about making sure others don't intrude on your writing time. But you can do that. You can block out a weekend, or you can get up. I'm not advising anyone to get up an hour earlier. What am I doing? This is the worst time of the year. But you can sort of carve your pockets of time and stick to them for a short duration.
You absolutely can, and you can kind of course, it's a lovely idea that you've got a room somewhere that you can retreat to and that you can work away. without any kind of interruptions. But it's also okay not to work like that. I mean, whenever I was writing at the beginning, writing say the first collection particularly, I always knew that I didn't want to do that, and that I wanted to write in the kitchen. I didn't want to take myself away from other people, and that whatever I was doing would be kind of integrated into just the general household activity. And so I got that, like, it didn't bother me at all. I could be writing away, and people could be coming in and out of the kitchen. The children were quite small. There was no issue. And I know that Ronan Hession, who I think is a great person, great writer. Ronan says he always writes in his house with the door open. So at any point, if people want to come in and chat and whatever, that's absolutely fine. So that his creative life is not something that's absolutely separate from or separate to his life as a partner, his life as a father, whatever. Now, again, it's one of those things. Some people might be thinking, no chance. There's no way I could ever work with people coming in and out, traipsing in, and you'd never be done with people interrupting you. And that's okay. But it's also all right if you don't have a space of your own. If you're, say, at lunchtime in work, finding some little spot and doing a little bit of writing in your half-hour lunch or whatever, that's also absolutely okay.
Brilliant. Wendy, I wanted to ask you before we a couple more questions before we come to the questions in the chat. And we've discussed a little bit the opening of a story and how there's a sort of, it's almost like if someone plays a chord, doesn't matter if it's a da 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 da, it could be very quiet, but there's a sort of surety to the opening. And I always love the phrase by the Irish writer Mary Lavin, where she talks about a story needs to be an arrow in flight. I think that might be my favorite description of a story. You've heard me say that a dozen times.
Yeah.
Because there's something of the tautness, the purity, the essentialness of that. I love the idea that a short story, if a reader is sitting down to read a novel, they are going to be, the sort of contract is they are going to be committing hours of their life to this novel. They're going to be reading for, a good amount of time. There's a sort of, they're in it for the long haul, unless they decide to abandon it, but they're in it for the long haul. With a short story, you're asking the reader to concentrate intensely for not very much and then have to do it again. And so I think that idea of the story has to be moving even before it starts. It doesn't mean there are pyrotechnics or, grenades going off, but somehow I think you need to cut in as late as possible to the action of the story. In terms of the ending then, I see the beginning and the ending as interlinked. And so for me, I'm always thinking I cut in as late as possible before the thing happens. And I cut out as early as possible after it's happened, or when it's just on the verge of happening, when it's, when the change is irrevocable. And I'm toggling with these, you can scroll them back, you can sort of play with them. But for me, the beginning and end, I'm doing like quantum entangled particles with my finger and thumb here. You can't change one without changing the other. So I think this is one of those reasons why for me, I have to do a really messy first draft before I can make those decisions. Is that, what do you like in terms of endings? Do you see the beginning and ending as relate? Because quite often I think when we're reading submissions for this award, you sometimes get the sense that people have run out of words and so they've stopped the story rather than the story naturally ending or ending with sort of craft.
Yeah, I mean, I love what you say there, that you're getting in as late as possible and you're leaving as early as possible. I think that's great advice to someone, or to anyone. I kind of think that people are very self-conscious about the opening, and I am too. Even though I know that the sort of, the, I don't know what people say about the, you've got to create this kind of showstopper of a an opening, or else people aren't going to read on. Like, I know that's absolute nonsense, but even I've written plenty of short stories, but I always feel that pressure initially as well. Like, I've got to get this ending, I've got to get this beginning just right. But your opening is having to service your story. And so there's no point in trying to make it full of pyrotechnics, and make it this sort of bravura writing that can't really be sustained in the rest of the story. So with the opening, it's one of the things I suppose with all literature that we're kind of buying into this idea that you're making an incision in time, using a Claire Keegan term, but it's almost as if these people have had a pre-existence prior to you entering that fictive world, and that these people are going to continue on after you make your exit. These people's lives are also in the story going to continue on, and that's quite a nice thing to think about as well. If you think about these people are there all of the time, so where are you going to enter their lives and where are you going to exit from their lives? And that's sometimes a helpful thing. Sometimes what I'll do as well is I'll kind of think, okay, so I've written this first paragraph, but if I start on the second paragraph, what's lost? Is there anything really lost with me starting in the second? And if nothing's been lost, then maybe I should start on the second paragraph. So there's all of those sorts of things. I think that people feel self-conscious as well about endings because there's a lot of stories where the meaning of the story resides in the ending. That the entire point of the story has been the ending. The entire point of the story is to build up to the ending. And so people think again it needs to be something incredibly totalizing at the end. And that's just not always necessary, you know?
So can you give an example of a story whose ending you love that's the opposite of that being tied up with a bow? Sort of, I love that word totalizing ending.
Yeah. Um, Let me think of a
Or
story
one
that.
of your own, if one of your own comes more easily to mind. Can you,
Oh, that's awful. If the only things I can reference are my own stories, that's terrible.
but again, it is that thing that, if
So
you're put on the spot and asked to talk about a story,
yeah,
you could, every single story you've ever read goes completely from your mind.
yeah. So say for example, let me pick a few stories. So say for example, this one I really like, Maggie's Day Out by
Francis Malloy.
Lloyd. And Maggie goes on a day out. Her husband's left to look after the kids. It goes appallingly wrong, and what we hear at the end is that Maggie doesn't leave for another number of years, and when she does, she takes children with her. She takes him with her, and say, right, okay. So it's suddenly something that's been very much in documenting what's happening quite chronologically, then zooms to the future. And it's like, right, okay, so that leaves me thinking, what happens in the intervening years? Where do they go whenever she goes, after all of these years? What's the fate of these particular kids? I think you got to trust your reader. Like, that's one of the things I think that what I'm hoping is that I'm going to get a reader who's going to meet me halfway and who wants to be co-opted into creating meaning. And so I don't need to. I think again it's the difference you were talking about, the difference between the novel and the short story. If someone's invested 9, 10 hours in reading a novel, for you just to say, it's over to you guys, what you think, it doesn't work. But with a short story, it's wonderful because you can leave multiple possibilities. So that would be a story that works like that. What do you think? Can you think of any that you think?
Yeah, well, one that always comes to mind for me is Chekhov's Lady with a Dog. And that's a story, actually, the very last word of that story is beginning. And it's a story of a man, a sort of jaded old adulterer, sees a pretty young woman, the titular lady with a dog, strikes up a friendship with her, sleeps with her, she's agonized, he's embarrassed, he tries to leave her. Or decides to leave her, but he can't, and he sees her again, and then he sees her again. And then by the end of the story, there are these heartbreaking lines about, was the story ends, with them on the precipice of thinking they are going to, she's going to leave her husband. They're going to try to make this work together. And the way that the story is written, I've read that story so many times, and sometimes I read it and I think, against all the odds, these people have found each other, and they met in the most unlikely of tropes, and yet they've transcended this and they found something real. Other times I read that story and I just think, these poor, foolish people, lost, lonely, they've got entangled in something that just should have stopped and they haven't managed to stop it and they're in too deep. Um, and you can, like, those are radically opposed
Mhm.
positions. And yet the story allows for them both. I think there's, the difference between ambiguity and confusion is really crucial. And I think trusting the reader, that you don't need to spell everything out for the reader, but you can leave some things up to the reader, is crucial.
Yeah, and that needs to be, I mean, I speak to a lot of visual artists, and they say things like, oh, they've no interest in, they're expressing, they're not, this isn't, I'm not talking in a blanket way about all visual artists, but some people saying that, they don't think at all about who views their work, and they don't think at all about the demands, or, what does the viewer need? That's a totally alien concept. Whereas I think a lot about the reader. I'm thinking tons about the reader, and I'm thinking about, am I confusing a reader here? Am I giving them enough there that there's ambiguity? So it can't be one of those things that you write and think, well, I like it, it works for me, and if anybody else likes it, it's a bonus. It has to be that you have thought about the demands of your of the reader. What are the demands of the story? What are you giving a reader? Does this result in confusion? And does this result in a really beautiful ambiguity, which there can be a total delight in,
And it's funny, I do that more and more. I think about the reader as abstract reader. Like I can't think of the reader as a specific person. Although sometimes, there are useful readers I've internalized, like my editor. I always put in a couple of exclamation marks so he can have the pleasure of deleting them because he hates it when I use exclamation marks. But I think about the reader as, I'm always thinking this short story is an act of co-creation. It's us coming together. And what am I requiring of the reader? What am I demanding of the reader? What am I, coercing the reader into? What am I offering the reader? What am I allowing the reader to bring to the story? So, but it's a funny, it's that I think sometimes that's a very hard thing to get a balance. And I've mentioned my editor, Wendy. I think for me, I think for both of us, editing isn't a process separate to the writing. Editing is there. For me, editing is sort of keeping the intuitive and intellectual faculties in check. It's a constant process. But one of the things I do find useful in an edit is running it past a friend, a first reader friend, of whom I just have a couple of very good ones, and asking them, like, do you think this is working? Am I going too far? Is this, overdoing it? So I think it can be very useful, maybe especially for people that are starting out, if you have a couple of people, and maybe not a parent or not a romantic partner, but someone who is also writing, so you can have a reciprocal arrangement, read each other's work, and just kind of test. Even just ask those questions. Is this working for you? Is this obvious? Is this too obvious? Is this boring you?
Yeah. Yeah. And I can remember when we were talking about this before, one time, Lucy, you said something that I've kind of remembered about having a specific question for people about whenever they're reading. So rather than just say, there you go, just give me your thoughts. What do you think? It's actually really useful for people to know, well, what is it you actually want to know about? Is it, are you asking somebody, do you buy it? Do you buy that a character would do that? Does that seem within the realms of possibility that someone would do that? Or is it to do with the ending? Does the ending work? Does the ending, satisfying or satisfactory? It's really good to give people just a little bit of a steer on what it is you want to know about for sure. And it's also as well, I think, quite often I don't show my work around loads of people, but the people that do read it, quite often it's people that I don't think they're not fans of literary fiction at all. I mean, they wouldn't define themselves as that. And that's really, really good as well, because you've got people that are reading it in a way quite fresh, not used to certain sorts of things. And if things can work for them, then good.
Yeah, brilliant. Do you have any really good editing tips, Wendy? Any sort of things that might be useful for people?
Yes, well, I'm maybe going to repeat some of the ones that I know that you also do. What I think for me is absolutely crucial. We were talking before about there not being any short story hacks. Is for me, if you're editing, and again, it's like so exciting whenever you realize with the editing that this whole thing is starting to mesh together. And again, to use an analogy, to me, it's like watching if in a dark room watching a photo appear where you can see this is starting to take some sort of form and it's quite exciting. Start again from scratch. Don't be messing around, with a Word document, doing copy and paste and shuffling sentences from one place to the next. To me, that's not editing. It's just shortcuts. And what you think to yourself is, oh, sure, that'll do for now. Sure, that's it. That'll do rightly. It won't. You're far, far better just starting again. Now, I don't mean scrapping your first draft. I mean printing off your first draft, having it there beside you, and you're making a judgment as you write again the second draft of what you're keeping and what you think you can do differently, and it just adds a freshness to it.
Yeah, I do exactly that. And I love it because it keeps it for me. When my short stories weren't working, they felt very like dead. And when I'm retyping them, not only does every sentence need to re-earn its place, so it's a really good, it's like the opposite of a hack because it's
Yeah.
very long-winded, but it's very good because it really drastically reduces the chances of you saying something kind of that's not good enough. But also, what I love is that you will know your characters far better on, a fifth or a sixth draft than you did at the beginning. And they will kind of trust you more. You will know them more. You'll be more confident. You will sometimes find them saying or doing things that if you were just cutting and pasting, there wouldn't be the space for the story to take flight in new ways. And you can just go with that. And if it doesn't work, you can just delete it or do a new draft. But it also means that for me, up until the very, very final moment, my story is alive and provisional, and people could still make a different decision. It could go a different way. And I think something of that quality, I have no idea how, but I think something of that quality translates into the finished story. You know,
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, even in the sense that if there's a character that in an earlier draft, maybe you in your final draft of like 10, 20, I don't know, 20 lines maybe devoted to this character, but in an earlier draft they were so much more fully fleshed out. Maybe they existed as there was hundreds of words on this character early on. What you're hoping is that something of that complexity or something or other to do with that more fully realized version of the person still makes it to that final draft. It's a very difficult thing to kind of quantify. It's very difficult to say, well, how would that happen with that specific character in your story or whatever. But it is something to do definitely with things having existed in a much more fully fleshed earlier version that it creates a kind of a complexity. They're not as flat.
yeah, it just works, doesn't it? I think my if I was to give one tip, if I were to give one tip to people um entering the competition, I would just say make sure, look at that deadline, midday on Wednesday the 11th or whatever, build in enough time to retype your story once or twice in its entirety. And the thing is, with a short story, it's the closest you're going to come to encountering it as a reader. If you just build in that time to just type it, it'll smooth all the various phases of composition, and it'll just you never know what it might yield.
And yeah, and don't think, oh, that's going to be a right pain having to do that again another two times. That's where the exciting stuff happens. It's really, really good.
Yeah, enjoying every stage of it, I think that's
Mhm.
that's key. Right, Wendy, brilliant. I'm going to go into the chat here, and we've got some questions here. Um, okay, lovely. So, uh, how long did it take each of you to start having success in short story competitions? Thank you, Kathy. Well, do you know what the funny thing is? I think I've been at this point, my first novel was published 20 years ago this spring, and I have been on every side of the short story. I've had things longlisted, shortlisted, won, not placed anywhere, and I've been a judge. And so to me, actually, what I would say is, take the competition with a huge pinch of salt. All of our winners, all of our shortlists, we're really proud of. And in fact, maybe particularly our shortlists, because what we do with the shortlist, Wendy and I judge it with Riley Johnson, brilliant writer herself, and we have a sort of radical rule that if two people really don't like a story, but one person champions it, it can go through. We really want stories to have a champion. We never want to just settle. Quite often, sometimes what will happen is there'll be a sort of people can't quite agree, or they have polarized positions, and so they will sort of settle on something. And yeah, we have never done that. We've allowed judges' passion to be a big part of it. But at the same time, I'm very aware that it is completely arbitrary. Julian Barnes calling competitions posh bingo. It's so true. And there have been competitions that I've won where I have known that my story is not as good as one of the stories that maybe wasn't placed or wasn't placed as highly. And there have been other times where I have submitted a story, or a story has been submitted on my behalf. It hasn't got anywhere. And I've thought, you know what, that's actually a really good story. And those are just, my own assessments of my work. But there's also the feeling that when you're submitting your story to this competition or to any competition, make sure you don't send your self-esteem with the email or in the post, because I think that can be really damaging. If you're sending stories and not seeming to get feedback, that can be hard. What's your experience with that, Wendy?
Well, I want people to enter this competition, and we do judge it so carefully, and I think that's the thing, that if you feel really passionate about it, it goes through. I think that works brilliantly. But I absolutely echo everything you're saying, that a competition is so arbitrary. It's the idea of what's best by a certain group of people on a certain day. A different group of people would think differently, and the same group of people on a different day might well think differently too. So it's just one of those things that is entirely subjective. I mean, I don't even like people saying the best books of 2025 as personal preference, masquerading as some kind of
Fact, yeah.
it's just nonsense. My goodness, the best books of 2025 just happen to be the ones you liked, right? So, it's just a load of nonsense. And there's luck in this as well. My dad was always such a lucky person with ballots and raffles and things. You just always knew if my dad entered a raffle that he would get something. And I think books are like that as well, and stories are like that. There's also a kind of a degree of luck. There's people that are kind of lucky with this. And I never won a short story competition, ever. Well, the only thing is, like, I did get to the final.
I am shocked to hear that, Wendy. Oh
I
my, I did not know that. My goodness.
don't think I have. I mean, I did get the short story choice, or Edge short story choice, or Reader's Choice, right? But that's not quite.
Yeah.
And I did get the final of the BBC, or not the BBC one, the Sunday Times won the short story competition. But I don't think I've ever won any short story competitions. But also as well, right?
And you're such a winner in my eyes.
We're in life.
Yeah.
Short story competition. But there's another thing. Like, I read short story collections, right? And right, let me give you an example. So there's Tim McGowan short story collection published by Scratch Books, and it's called Saints. And I think it's a great collection. I really enjoyed it. But I wouldn't be surprised if none of Tim's stories won a competition, because they're just not the sort of thing that necessarily might win competitions. But does that not make them a great collection? A great collection of stories? They're absolutely brilliant. And there's stories as well that kind of operate, that it's this that sort of gestalt idea, that these individual stories work together to create something that's kind of more than the sort of sum of the parts. So there's all sorts of things there. So absolutely know that know that the whole thing is done with such care, this competition, but at the same time just take it with a bit of a pinch of salt. Absolutely.
Um, okay. Jamie says, is there anything you wished you'd done sooner that would have made publishing or writing books easier?
Um, I Right, see, I didn't have anything published until I was 50. And in some ways I hope that's an encouraging thing for people, that you shouldn't feel that you're over the hill, or things won't get published or whatever, if you're not kind of like a sort of wunderkind style person, because there's loads and loads of people that don't get anything published until they're over 50 or thereabouts. There's Annie Proulx, there's Louise Kennedy, there's all sorts of people. And like what I said loads of times was like, oh, I didn't really have anything to write about until I was older, but I actually think that was true at all. I kind of think I probably could have been publishing things, or I could have been not maybe not publishing, but I could have been writing, from my twenties onwards, and I just didn't. But there was nothing stopping me, and there was no good reason really why I didn't. I just kind of got distracted by other things, and also as well didn't really have any. I suppose I just didn't really have any sort of notion as to how I would go about it. And I suppose, if I'd gone on a stinging fly course or something like that when I was in my twenties, maybe I would have written back then, but never too late.
Yeah, and I was at the other end of the spectrum where I wrote my first novel as an undergraduate, and it was published, and I wrote subsequent novels and plays. But actually, it's funny. I do feel that I didn't write any of the things that I was meant to be writing until I started writing my short stories. And so it's funny. You can, in an ideal world, I think I would publish nothing until I published like a perfect collection of short stories. But that's pure fantasy. This is like back to the notebook fantasy, the illusion of perfectionism. It's like only you have got the stories that you can write. There's no point trying to write anyone else's. Only you have got. There's a lovely phrase of Yeats that I like, the rag and bone shop of the heart from the circus animals' desertion. And I always like the idea that every single one of us is just this very particular accumulation of junk, all the stuff we've done, we've thought, we've dreamed, we've fantasized, we've taken in, that's happened to those close to us. And all of it's inert until a couple of things combust and suddenly it's your material for something. And like, there's no point wishing that you had a different set of rag and junk in your rag and bone shop. There's no point wishing that you had a different life or different stories to tell. It's like, there's no point wishing that you hadn't written all the books until you wrote one that was worth anything, because I think only you have got that unique and particular aperture onto the universe that's yours and yours only. And that's, yeah, there's sort of no point wishing that it was any different, in just the same way that there's no point wishing you were another kind of writer, or that you had another writer's back catalogue or another writer's success. It's so completely irrelevant to, you can only write the stories that you can write. That's the only thing worth spending any time on, I think.
That's it, and you don't need to be good at everything. There's not any. It's not like you're doing an essay in school where there's a set of assessment objectives and you have to meet each of those assessment objectives. That you have to be able to do A, B, C, D, and E. You're the boss, so you write about the things and you write in the way that you want to write, that you think that you can do really well.
Yeah, brilliant. It's your playground, not your prison. I
Yeah.
tell myself that all the time when I feel that I'm, succumbing to despair over a story not working or over writing in general. I always think, this is your playground. This is not your prison. You get to set the rules. You get to leave. You get to walk away and never do it again. Um, okay, so here's another one. When did you ever worry about developing characters inspired by people you know? Does it work that way for you?
No, it doesn't really work, right. So um it doesn't really work that way for me, and I think I've always kind of felt from the beginning that my job is essentially to make things up. My job is to invent things, and I always have wanted to live in the real world. And I've always felt that I've never really wanted to use people I know, or to kind of like base characters on actuality. I've never really felt like that at all, and it's felt quite important to me that the things should be invented. And I've written a little bit of nonfiction, and I've found that incredibly difficult to do, for those sorts of reasons. However, what I would say is that writing is also quite an unconscious, subconscious thing. And so that very consciously you can be deciding that you're not going to write about this or this or this, but things seep in without you realizing. And so, I did have one story where I never liked writing about schools because I work in a school, and so I've always avoided them pretty much. Um, but there was one story that I wrote was about primary school, and one person said to me, "Oh, I really like the story you wrote about Mrs. So and so," and I was like, "It wasn't about her." Like they thought it was about her, and I thought, how peculiar that they thought it was about her. And then after the fifth person said to me, I love the story about Mrs. So and so, right? I had to start thinking, right, okay, to what extent was there something unconscious happening whenever I was writing there? So writing's such a mysterious thing as well. It's so to do with the unconscious workings of the mind as well as the very deliberate and conscious. So I've tried to avoid it where I can, and I actually think the characters are all the better for inventing things. Sometimes whenever I read people's work and I can see, oh, that's this, and that's that person, I kind of think, oh, you know, but the unconscious is also at work.
Actually, Wendy, you know exactly what detail I'm going to alight upon here. But I want to ask you, how, if you're making characters up, do you make them feel real and seem real? And one of my favorite examples of this, not just in your work, but in fiction in general, is a woman who has this elaborate sexual fantasy about her brother-in-law. Um, and then she meets him, and she realizes that he's wearing the sort of, apologies to anyone who wears these shoes, but he's wearing the sort of shoes that have the rubber bit, like that go up around the back of the heel. And it's like instantly like a pin into a balloon. The whole elaborate sexual fantasy is completely punctured because she just knows she could never fancy someone that wore that type of shoes. And it's kind of heartbreaking when that detail comes in the story. Like, it's funny and it's heartbreaking, and I always think you have such a talent for that, for like seizing on, or homing in on exactly the perfect detail. And of course, in short stories where you don't have many words to do it, there's even more pressure on the details to be right without being too done. Like how do you come up with details like that?
Don't know that. Well, I'm so glad that you like that. I'm so glad that you like that bit. Yeah, because she spent so long. It's been so elaborate and over such a period of time, and she's really convinced herself that if she was with this man, her life would be just immeasurably better and so on. But it just goes like that whenever she sees these shoes. I don't know. I suppose I was just thinking maybe a little bit about myself and how, it could well be that I could think someone was great and then they'd give their opinion on one matter and I'd be like, oh my goodness, did you hear what they said about that? And it totally changes my opinion. So I suppose I just took something that maybe I felt a little and kind of, transposed it into another sort of, well, it being something verbal, making it something to do with the shoes. So yeah, I don't really know how that came about, but I'm glad you liked it.
Yeah, brilliant. Right, let's see. Okay, lovely. Okay, any any sources, Wendy, other than stories or novels that you find useful as an early writer or still find useful now? Any collections of essays or particular writers speaking on craft that you would recommend?
No, no, right. No, I'm going to read, right. So if you wrote something in that vein, Lucy, I would certainly read it. But I've never read it. I've never read any essays on craft in my life or any kind of writer speaking on it. There's only about three people I want to hear talking about things like that, and I'm speaking to one of them. And so no, I don't bother with that type of thing. Like I was having to write screenplays, and I did buy a book that was sort of to teach you how to write those, but I realized quite quickly, no, I would be better just watching a couple of films. So I would have to say no, right? I don't really read that kind of thing. But what I do is, yes, there's tons of sources that I find useful. Things like Belfast Live, things like Liverpool Live, things like Take a Break magazine, anything that's to do with people's lives. Those are the sorts of things. Just listening to people telling the stories about their lives. I don't mean that I'm looking to get material, but to look at how people go about constructing stories that they tell each other about what's important in their lives and how people convert their lives to kind of like short stories. So I suppose I've never been all that interested in reading books and craft. Having said that, I read tons and tons. I do love reading, and I'm not reading, making notes on people's techniques, but there's something that happens if you're reading that in some way you must internalize what people are doing, and what works. What about you, Lucy? Would you read?
Yeah, I mean, I've sort of accumulated some books on craft, or I'm sent them, but I would like we've both established our love of Ursula Le Guin. So this is with no disrespect to Ursula Le Guin, but she has a book on craft, and it's really disappointing how quickly the tone becomes very didactic and pompous. One tiny example, she's talking about point of view, and she says, your classic points of view are first person, talks about first person choral, which is we, third person close, third person distant, all these kind of things. And then she has this one sentence where she says, occasionally a writer thinks that they've discovered second person and they bore us with that for a while, but enough said on that. And I think, oh, come on, Ursula, I'm one of your biggest fans ever. I love the second person. I write so much in the second person. And I think, do you know what? I don't even think you believe that. I think that you're writing your chapter, maybe with a deadline, and you've slipped into a sort of slightly pompous teacherly tone, and you've just dismissed the second person. And I'm sure that actually, even if you hate the second person, if you were here, we could have a discussion, and we could, but so I'm always kind of wary of I guess my instinct is always, as we've been doing, Wendy, if the second I find myself saying it must be done like this, or I do it like this, I always want to,
Yeah,
provide an opposite example.
your balance.
But I think that said, I do love the Paris Review interviews. I remember loving those, especially when I was starting out, because they are just interviews with writers talking about how they write. And so you will get whatever you're looking for, you'll find it. Like my idea of retyping as a way of editing, I got that as a young writer from Joan Didion's Paris Review interview. She says, they ask her if she's got any tips, and she says, yes, I retype, and she got it from Hemingway, Hemingway's Paris Review interview. And there's another thing that Graham Greene says. Graham Greene says it's always really hard starting. So he says the day before, never finish off your scene. Maybe don't even finish off your sentence. So the next day, you've left yourself with something very easy to do. You can sort of shortcut the existential dread of the blank page or the opening of a scene. And you're eager to do it because it's small and achievable. And then you've tricked yourself into starting. So I think the Paris Review is actually a goldmine for this sort of thing. You can get lots of them free online, or you can get secondhand copies online pretty easily.
I think that's such great advice, that leave it at a little place that you're quite excited to get back to. So if something seems to be starting to work, leave it at that
Yeah.
point. It's just so exciting to get back to that for sure.
So
Absolutely.
yeah, so that is Eileen, that is the Paris Review, which is actually an American literary magazine, still publishing, I think, biannually or quarterly. Um, last question here. Um, can short story merge to sound like memoir? Um, or can the story be visually described like cinematic style? What are your views on that, Wendy? Sort of different types of story, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I think that's one of the things, right? So we're just talking here about, different types of writing, collections of essays, or work on craft, or whatever. You could spend the rest of your life, if you wanted, reading nothing but collections on craft, and you could spend the rest of your life attending art of the short story events. I mean, it's almost like an industry, the sort of art of the short story. Now I love that because I like the form, but it wasn't initially a form that I was drawn to, because I think sometimes the discourse around it is really kind of quite off-putting. It seems very technical. It seems really kind of, just very, very, it is a very exacting form, but it makes it seem as though it's very restrictive, but it's not. It's one of the most flexible forms ever. There's just so much that you can do. So I kind of think everything that you're saying there, like, a story merging to sound like a memoir, or something that's really cinematic that doesn't have this big focus on character. Brilliant. How wonderful. That sounds great. I love character, but I love reading stories that have nothing, the character's not really a major consideration. So, say for example, David Hayden, I think he's a really interesting short story writer. David's not interested in character in the same way that I am. And some of his stories would be very, very surreal and dreamlike, very cinematic. Wonderful. That's absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Wendy, is there who has been a writer that has excited you recently?
Well, I think like a lot of people, a really, really exciting writer is the new Stinging Fly writer, Layden. I mean, absolutely brilliant collection. Really enjoyed that such a lot.
One Still Here is a
Yeah.
collection.
Absolutely terrific collection. Wonderful. I really liked the one I was talking about earlier as well, Tim McGowan's one, which is set in Mexico, and it's a collection of stories, and the people are all loosely related because they're all to do with the sort of Narcotics Anonymous group. And that was a great one. I actually did an event with a guy in Birmingham called Alan Beard, and I really enjoyed. I don't read lots of flash fiction, that kind of writing all that much, but I really enjoyed what he'd done. Lucy, obviously your new collection, utterly wonderful, just superb.
Thank you. Very, very kind of you, Wendy. Thank you. Yeah, I'm reading some stories by Ruth Ozeki at the moment that I've just got in proof. That I was gonna say I've never read her short stories before, but in fact, although she's a novelist, this is her first collection. And yeah, I'm enjoying They're playful. I've really liked the couple I've read so far. And I've got another, there's a writer by called Sana Ahmed, who's published a collection with Pushkin called The Age of Calamities. And I'm just going to read the opening paragraph of this because this is really fun. It's a story called Let's Play Dead. And it opens, there was a man, let's call him Henry VIII. There was his wife, let's call her Anne B. Let's give him a castle and make it nice. Let's give her many boy babies, but make them dead. Let's give him a fussy way of being. Let's make her smart and sneaky because it's such a mean thing to do. Let's make it so she can't escape, just for fun. Let's seal the bottle and shake it and shake till our hands fall off. And it's such a fun, playful way of, you think how on earth do you approach the Tudors after Hilary Mantel, and you might be tempted to think that's such a big topic, such a well-known topic. And here's a writer who's just coming in aslant in a really provocative and playful way that I think is really, really fun. And it's a reminder that it's a reminder to have fun with it, I think. For all the anxieties and all of the difficulties there can be when you're starting out or hoping that you'll get published or submitting stories for the first time. I think bringing it back to that sense of fun and the stories that you and only you can tell, whether that's in terms of content or form or tone or style. I think that's what I would like people to take away.
Yeah, that sounds absolutely. Couldn't agree more. And another thing as well is don't be frightened to be sincere. At the same time, if there's things that you care about deeply, and there's characters that you care about deeply, wonderful. It's great.
Yeah, lovely, beautiful words. Okay, thank you so much, everyone. Really hope that you get writing and get your stories in. Double check the submission guidelines, the word counts, the dates, the times, all of that kind of thing. But really hope to be meeting lots of you at Belfast Book Festival. It's going to run between the 4th to the 11th of June this year, and it's going to be a fantastic program that the team that Sophie and Gail and the team are putting together. So really hope to see you there. Come and say hello if you're at one of our events. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks, Wendy.
Thank you so much, Lucy.